This is one of the most explosive books of the Renaissance, and it couldn't be published for 150 years after it was written. In it, its author is revealed as one of the great artists of his day, but also as a murderer and necromancer who had to be pardoned by the Pope. And when it was eventually published in 1728, it was a book as mysterious as the man who wrote it, and a counterfeit was issued 70 years later. This is the story of Benvenuto Cellini, one of the great artists of the Renaissance, who wrote his autobiography simply called Vita, or The Life. And in this video, we're going to look at Cellini's incredible life, see how he wrote the book and how it survived, before looking at what happened 150 years later when it was finally published in the first edition. But the chaos of Cellini's life is reflected in the book that records it, so we're going to have to decipher whether this is the real first edition or a counterfeit. Benvenuto Cellini was born in the year 1500 and worked at the height of the Renaissance. He trained as a goldsmith, but also produced larger works like statues, as well as smaller decorative pieces in gold and silver, as well as drawings and self-portraits. These are two of his most famous works, which you might know, and they're on completely different scales. This is his salt cellar, produced for the King of France, and it's about 10 to 12 inches, as wide as it is tall, and all of this extravagance was to produce a vessel to house the king's salt and pepper. And then there's his Perseus with the head of Medusa, which you might have seen if you've been to Florence. It stands there in the Piazza della Signoria in beautiful bronze. Cellini felt overlooked as an artist, but admired Michelangelo, who he says praised him and who he also says he worked under. And so this work, rather poetically, was placed in this square in Florence, opposite Michelangelo's David. And so Cellini's Perseus holds up his head of Medusa, pointing it directly at the David, as if turning it from marble into stone. So we can see some of the mischief of Cellini here, but his life has a much darker side. He was a violent man, and in the Vita he boasts of this violence. In Paris there was a man who sued him, so Cellini responded by attacking him with his dagger, rendering him disabled. But he also went further than this, committing 3 murders. He murdered a rival goldsmith, he randomly murdered a postmaster, and he tracked down the man who killed his brother and murdered him as well. And these weren't his only brushes with the law. He was convicted of sodomy twice and accused of it many more times. He was falsely imprisoned for stealing the Pope's jewellery, and even employed a necromancer to summon a devil to Rome's Colosseum. But somehow he managed to avoid being held accountable for most of his life, with one pope, he claims, even saying, "Men like Benvenuto, unique in their profession, do not need to be subject to the law." What's incredible about Cellini and his life is that we don't need to go trawling through the archives to find these accusations and records of his crimes. Instead, for most of them at least, he talks about them openly in the Vita, his autobiography. He wrote this, or at least dictated it to one of his apprentices, at some time in the 1550s, but it remained unpublished during the rest of his life. It's maybe little surprise that such a tinderbox of scandal and salaciousness, of murder and accusation, shouldn't be published during the author's own lifetime. Jerry Brotton has this wonderful turn of phrase that while Caravaggio is seen as the classic bad boy of the Renaissance, Cellini makes him look like a choir boy. And it's true, in this work, through his own confessions and his own admissions, Cellini really does make Caravaggio look like a choir boy. So why did he write all of this down? Cellini thought himself, as he describes in the Vita, as a great artist, but his Vita wasn't the most significant biography or autobiography of artists published in the Renaissance. That work was Giorgio Vasari's Vitae, or the lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors and architects. Vasari was the first Italian art historian, and his Lives, which was first published in 1550, gives biographies of the artists of the day. But in 1550, when it was first published, and when it was expanded to nearly 200 artists in 1568, it didn't feature a biography of Cellini. If he was going to be remembered, he would have to record the story of his life and his achievements himself. In fact, he opens the Vita by saying, "I must do what I find others do, to tell the story of my life with a certain amount of pride." And Cellini's work survives because it's circulated in manuscript form for the next century and a half. There's even an indication that Vasari himself had access to an early manuscript copy, and he used this as justification for not including Cellini in the expanded edition of his lives. And it's because of this survival, a survival spurred no doubt in part by people wanting to get their hands on this amazing story of Cellini's life, that in 1728 this book can finally be published. It appeared in print 157 years after Cellini's death, but much like Cellini's life, this book isn't what it seems. If we open up our copy, the first thing we should do is look to the title page, and this reads Vita di Benvenuto Cellini, or the life of Benvenuto Cellini, and I love the contrast here, because as we remember, Vasari's work was called Vitae, or the lives, whereas Cellini's, rather grandly, if egotistically, is just called Vita, the life. You don't need to worry about all those other lives. This is the life you need to read. And it goes on to say that he's a Florentine goldsmith and sculptor, that it's written in his own hand by himself, and that many interesting curiosities and peculiarities are touched on regarding the art and history of his own time. But this title page also includes 2 lines. At the foot of the title page, we can see that it was printed, or claims to be printed, in Cologne, or Cologne, Germany, and that it was printed there per Pietro Martello, or by someone called Pietro Martello. Now, Pietro Martello wasn't a real person, certainly wasn't a real printer. They didn't exist. This was a name used by printers all across Europe when they were publishing a book that they thought might lead to censorship. And so, to disguise the identity of the real printer, they would put Pietro Martello if it was an Italian book, maybe Pierre Marteau if it was a French book, or Peter Hammer if it was an English book. And with this as the name of the printer and the printer's real identity concealed, they hoped that they wouldn't be troubled or shut down. And another way to throw off the authorities, of course, is to lie about where it was printed, because this says it was printed in Cologne or in Cologne, but it wasn't. We actually know that this was printed in 1728 in Naples, and it was printed there under the patronage of the famous castrato and bibliophile Gaetano Berenstadt. If we go over the page, we can see a preface that was written by Antonio Cocchi, but this is hidden as well. He's also concealing his identity and issuing the preface under a pseudonym. With so much duplicity in the writing, survival and publication of this book, to say nothing of the chaos of the actual life it records, it's perhaps no surprise that identifying this as a true first edition has an added layer of complexity. In 1798, a counterfeit edition of this book was issued in Florence by Bartolini. More people clearly wanted to read the amazing story of Cellini's life, and Bartolini wanted to pass off his production as the original first edition. And so if we want to identify whether what we have is the true first edition or one of these 1798 counterfeits, we're going to have to return to the title page. On the left here, we've got the true first edition's title page, and on the right, you can see the title page for the counterfeit edition of 70 years later, and you can see that they're very similar. Both, of course, claim to be printed by Pietro Martello in Cologne, even though both books weren't printed in Cologne, they were printed in Italy. But if we want to identify the difference, we'll have to look at where the line breaks are, because here we can see in the true first edition, we have a line break halfway through the word appartenenti, whereas in the counterfeit edition, we have the line break after the word toccano. And so if we look at the same line in our copy, we can see that we have the true first edition with the line break halfway through a Partenenti. But we don't also have that. We have the first edition in an entirely contemporary state. The binding is what we call carta rustica, where the book is covered in layers of handmade paper. You can even see the stitching going along the joint here. And inside we have the whole text in an original state, with the contents uncut and unpressed. They haven't been treated or trimmed by a binder indicating a later binding. Instead, this copy is as it would have been in 1728, when readers would have been queuing up to hear about Cellini's amazing life for the first time. Books like this are incredible, but nothing beats seeing them in person. And so at the end of this month, on July 26th and 27th, I'm going to be exhibiting in Bath at the Bath Book Fair, where this book, if it remains available, and others like it, I will be having on show and offering for sale and showing to members of the public. So I'll put a link down here about where you can find more details about the Bath Book Fair and how you can get a free ticket. And if you can make it, I'd love to see you there.